Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honor and privilege to rise today from the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation and to serve the community of Nanaimo, Ladysmith, in the traditional territories of Snaw-Naw-As, Nanaimo, Stz'uminus, and Lyackson First Nations. There are many things I would have liked to see covered in the fall economic statement, but first I want to address some concerns about the Canadian response to the pandemic. The countries that have done a good job of beating the spread of COVID-19 have all had a national approach. During an adjournment proceeding debate about the need for a more coordinated national effort, the response I received was that the government did not want to create a constitutional crisis. More than 23,000 people have died. The economy has been driven into the ditch. We've racked up the deficit to astronomical heights. 180,000 small and medium-sized enterprises across this country are on the verge of closing permanently. Millions of Canadians are financially stressed. We have a mental health crisis and a shadow epidemic of intimate partner violence and murder. I'm hearing more about suicides. We're in the third wave of the pandemic, with new records being set for daily case counts. We have another series of lockdowns in Canada's biggest provinces, and people are fed up. Our governments have done a poor job of working together to fight this pandemic, but at least we've managed to avoid a constitutional crisis. We're on the yo-yo, close, open, close again plan, rather than a get to zero plan. And it's been a huge mistake. During the early days of the pandemic, the members of this parliament worked together to get programs in place to help Canadians get through the economic lockdown. Early in the pandemic, the Green Party called on the government to look at what other countries were doing to successfully stop the spread of COVID-19, save lives, and protect the economy, including mask mandates for indoor spaces, widespread testing, and limiting travel. Multiple times, starting at the beginning of the pandemic, the Green Party advocated for the government to invoke the Emergencies Act, using the provisions of a public health emergency. It's a very reasonable and well-written piece of legislation, and it was drafted at a time when the government was not dealing with an emergency. Invoking the Emergencies Act would have allowed the government to create a federally coordinated response with the provinces, close the border, mandate quarantines for people returning to Canada, control interprovincial and interregional travel, create green zones for opening the economy, and red zones to control areas where there was community spread with lockdowns. These are all things that were done in New Zealand, Australia, and a list of other countries that successfully stopped the spread of the virus. But our calls to invoke the Emergencies Act were rebuffed. When the variants arrived in Canada, we called for an emergency debate and for the development of a strategic plan to deal with the strains that are more virulent. No dice. Now we have 3 highly contagious variants spreading rapidly in this country. Our dysfunctional federal system also affects our action on climate change, or lack thereof.
I do want to interrupt just for a second because I got sidetracked, and I'm just wondering, I think the member may have said he was sharing his time, but I'm not quite sure. Maybe he could remind me.
Yes, I'd like to share my time with the Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Ladysmith.
Okay. We have the worst record for climate action and emissions reductions in the G8 and in comparison to the European Union. We've increased our emissions by more than 21% over 1990 levels, while the UK has reduced emissions by 40%. And on average, all of the countries of the EU have reduced emissions by 25%. Canada has signed on to 9 international agreements on climate change and agreed to a set of targets for each of those agreements. Canada has had only one plan to meet those targets under the Martin government and has met none of the targets we agreed to. Our response to climate change is pathetic, but at least we haven't triggered a constitutional crisis. You know, climate change and pandemics don't understand jurisdictional boundaries. Now back to the fall economic statement. There's a serious need for additional support for small and medium-sized businesses. According to research done by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, 180,000 companies are on the verge of closing their doors forever. Small and medium-sized businesses are the engine of our economy and hire far more private sector employees than big businesses do. They're asking for government to extend and expand COVID relief programs for small businesses until the entire economy can reopen, including our borders, and small businesses can once again serve customers in person. The most recent lockdown in Canada's 4 largest provinces are testing the limits of small business operators. The same thing can be said for the nonprofit sector, which also needs continued support. We know that women have been heavily impacted by this pandemic, and it has set back advancements in the workplace by decades. We need a just recovery that begins with serious funding for early childhood education and a universal child care program. The Green Party has been calling for universal child care for years. We need increased support for the organizations that work with women who are facing intimate partner violence. Funding for the organizations was inadequate to begin with, and the pandemic has demonstrated why these organizations need more support. The work from home and learn from home requirements that the pandemic created has shown that there is an urgent need for access to high-speed internet for rural and low-income Canadians across the country. Post-secondary students have had a difficult time during this pandemic and need far more support. For years, the Green Party has been calling on the Canadian government to adopt the Northern European model for post-secondary education and eliminate tuition fees. At the very least in this moment, students should be getting relief for tuition fees and have current student loan payments written off. Seniors have been hit particularly hard during the pandemic. They have lost the community services and supports they rely on to make ends meet. They need increases to old age security and to the guaranteed income supplement. The tragedy in long-term care homes in Canada has laid bare the need for proper standards to ensure that our seniors are not warehoused in profit centers, but instead are provided with homes and the dignity they deserve. The Green Party has called for national standards for long-term care homes, including implementing a basic care guarantee and increasing the number of trained staff in long-term care facilities to ensure a minimum of 4 hours of regulated personal care per day for every resident. We have called for better standards for workers, and we called on the government to take the profit motive out of long-term care and focus funding on nonprofit, community-based care facilities. Again, on this issue, we are told that setting national standards would create problems with the provinces, even though some provinces have clearly failed to properly care for seniors. Canada is the only country that has universal health care, but does not include universal pharmacare. And as a result, Canadians are paying way too much for their essential prescription medicines. Too many seniors in this country have to make impossible choices between taking medications as prescribed or paying for other essentials. Seniors are ending up with healthcare complications and hospitalizations because they can't afford to take their medicines. People have lost their jobs, have also lost their benefits, and are faced with increased costs for medication. It's time for a universal pharmacare program. We need to get this done. All over this country, there are still many people who are in trouble because they lost their jobs due to the pandemic. The Financial Post reported last week that we are now at a 5-year high for Canadians facing insolvency. This is a problem that will only lessen once the pandemic is in the rearview mirror. Until then, we must ensure that we don't let people lose everything due to COVID-19, because when people fall into poverty, the odds that they will be able to recover from such a setback are diminished. Many of the pandemic support programs left people falling through the cracks. Since 2006, the Green Party has been calling for a guaranteed livable income to set an income floor under which no Canadian could fall. A GLI would have been very helpful to have in place before the pandemic, but it is also something that will help with the changes we will experience with automation and artificial intelligence, eliminating jobs. It will also help us deal with the changes that climate change is bringing. We have an affordable housing and homelessness crisis in this country, and a whole bunch of eviction notices that are going to come due when the pandemic restrictions are released. We need increased government funding to deal with these dual crises, but we also need structural changes to deal with the increased financialization of residential housing and predatory investment practices. Housing is a human right, and we need to make sure that right is met in this country. Madam Speaker, the Green Party will be supporting this bill. We want and expect better for Canadians, and will continue to work with the government to improve the services that Canadians want and need. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I have two quick questions for the member. First of all, I was interested by the question he asked in question period with respect to monetary policy. In 1974, when the Bank of Canada changed its policy, the inflation rate was at 11%. Is he concerned that the policy he was advocating in question period might lead to increased inflation? There's a lot of worry about the potential for long-run inflation already as a result of current government policy. My second question is about housing. I heard him speak about housing. I know he tabled a petition on that earlier today as well. It seems to me that one of the key issues around cost of housing is housing supply, and you can make all kinds of regulations and requirements, but if you don't increase the supply, the cost is going to continue to be very, very high, and you can consider policies that incentivize an increase in housing supply as a way of trying to address housing availability and affordability. Does the member have ideas or a plan on what could be done in that respect?
The honourable member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Well, I'd like to thank the honourable member for his question. In the past, the Bank of Canada has managed inflation during those years, 1938 to 1974, by limiting the supply of money. They limit the supply of money now that is created through our fractional reserve system. So it can be done, and we just need to have policy built around that. In terms of housing, what's happening in the housing market is we need more affordable housing built. Companies aren't building affordable housing, they're building market rate housing, and so much affordable housing right now is being flipped into market rate housing. So we're seeing investors coming into the market, buying up older housing stock that was affordable, and now that housing stock is being rented out at higher rates. Where there's no rent controls, they can just increase the...
Unfortunately, I do have to allow for other questions. Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Drummond.
The honourable member for Drummond. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I congratulate my colleague for his speech. And, Madam Speaker, we are here in this third wave of the pandemic when the government is, I hope, starting to look at post-pandemic plans. And as my honourable colleague was saying earlier in the speech, once the pandemic is behind us, we'll be ready. But I've heard my colleague from the Green Party, but I haven't heard what the very essence of that party should be, and that is the environment. I did not hear the Green Party member tell me about a green post-pandemic recovery, but the Bloc Québécois has presented a recovery plan that really focuses on the forestry industry. My two brilliant colleagues from Jonquière and Lac-Saint-Jean presented that initiative. And I'd like to ask my honourable colleague from Nanaimo, Ladysmith, what he thinks about the importance that should be granted to the issue of the environment post-pandemic. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I agree. We do need a green recovery. I didn't get a full 20-minute speech here, so I couldn't cover off on a lot of the issues that I'd like to cover off on. I did mention our lack of real climate action in this country, and there's a lot that we could be doing around that, and there's a lot that we should be doing around the crash in biodiversity as well. And we have documents that we have presented for green recovery and for full recovery of the Canadian economy.
We have time for a brief question. The honourable member for Don Valley Kingsway, sorry. Oh, Vancouver Kingsway. Vancouver Kingsway. Sorry, it's been 2 weeks since we've been in Parliament.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, I'd like to congratulate my honourable colleague for his speech. Frankly, I think every single thing he mentioned is core NDP policy as well. But I wanted to focus on housing because it's been said that COVID has created many crises, but it's also exposed other crises that were pre-existing, and one is the housing crisis. There's nothing in this legislation really that deals with the incredible existential foundational crisis facing so many Canadians who can't find an affordable, secure place to live. My question to him is, does he agree with me as a New Democrat that we should get the federal government to restart a national co-op housing program to build 500,000 units of affordable co-op housing in this country over the next 10 years? Is that something he would support?
Very brief answer from the member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would absolutely support funding for cooperative housing. I think co-ops are a great model. They create community. People can age in place. You lose your job, you don't lose your home because your housing cost is based on your income. And so I would absolutely support that, and it's something I've been calling for in my motions and in my petitions and in statements in the House.